dance of limits. Long after midnight, the lamps in Professor Elena Mori's cramped study at the University of New Westphalia still burned. Fine motes of dust drifted lazily in the light, as if the universe were taking its sweet time to settle all its mysteries. Stacks of books, precarious and defiant, lined the cramped edges of her desk and shelves. There were codices on Gödel's incompleteness, annotated printouts of Turing's original paper on the Entscheidungs problem, and a half-finished manuscript on Wolfram's principle of computational equivalence. Between these there lingered a mug of cold coffee with a faint film over its surface. It was a tableau of intellectual obsession. Elena pinched the bridge of her nose. Too many hours poring over texts, too many notes scribbled in green ink. She detested red, said it reminded her of hastily corrected proof sheets. Her brown hair was piled into a messy knot, secured more by tension than by the clasp that threatened to slip at any moment. She glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. Perfect. The witching hour for pure thought. Just as she sank back into her chair, a soft rap at the door startled her. It was unusual for anyone to be roaming the corridor at this hour. Perhaps a student who lost track of time in the library, or the janitor who occasionally checked on her to ensure she was still alive. She opened the door a crack. There stood Dr. Yusuf Kazemi, the new postdoc from the Department of Theoretical Computer Science. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a navy sweater with the university crest. He held a shoebox. His expression was that curious blend of eagerness and embarrassment, like a man delivering a surprise birthday cake too early. "Professor Mori," he said, voice low so as not to wake the sleeping building. "I found it." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Found what, Dr. Kazemi?" He hesitated, looking down at the shoebox, then back up at her. "The machine," he whispered, as though pronouncing some secret heresy. "The one rumoured in the old sub-basement archives." Elena's eyes narrowed. She had heard the rumours. Supposedly, decades ago, a reclusive mathematician-turned-engineer had built a machine designed to answer unanswerable questions, an oracle of sorts. It was a story told late at night to fresh graduate students, often followed by laughter and clinking beer bottles. Certainly no one believed it was real. But Kazemi, who had a knack for rummaging in places best left forgotten, had a look of genuine triumph in his eyes. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him and his shoebox pass. He placed it gently on her desk. It looked nothing like an oracle. It was a battered wooden box, roughly shoebox-sized indeed, with a few wires sticking out and a tiny LCD screen on one side. A small metal plaque, tarnished with age, read, "Project Archon." The device hummed softly, even unplugged, as if it fed off the ambient tension. "Yusuf, if this is some kind of prank," Elena started, but he lifted a hand and nodded toward the device. "Watch," he said, and pressed a tiny red button on its side. The LCD flickered. Words scrolled across it. "Enter query." Elena leaned forward. "This is ridiculous." "Humour me," Yusuf said, that boyish grin taking shape at the corners of his mouth. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He flattened it on the desk and read aloud. "Ask it something unanswerable, something no known system can solve." Elena thought for a moment. "How about the halting problem?" she said. "A classic, a known unsolvable problem. Let's see what it does." Yusuf nodded and typed, "Will the following program halt?" He inserted a snippet of code he'd written earlier that afternoon, an elegant tangle that, as far as anyone could tell, had behavior too complex to predict. The screen flashed. "Processing." They waited. 5 seconds. 10. The machine hummed. After a minute it flashed again. "Cannot determine." Elena smirked. "Well, nothing new there. It's just a trick device that can't do what it's supposed to." "Wait," Yusuf said. "I have another idea." He leaned over and typed in another query. Something more philosophical. "Is there a true statement in arithmetic that is unprovable within Peano arithmetic?" This time the device whirred louder. The LCD flickered. Lines of gibberish passed by. After a long moment it answered. "Yes." Elena rolled her eyes. "So it gives trivial answers. Everyone knows Gödel proved that." But Kazemi leaned in again. "Let's try something else, something really big." His eyes shone with a mischievous light. "What if we ask it about the future of knowledge itself?" He typed, Is human knowledge fundamentally limited by computational irreducibility? The device sputtered and shook. The old wood creaked. After a tense silence, it spat out a single phrase. To understand, you must go downstairs. They stared at each other. Downstairs? Elena laughed nervously. We're on the ground floor. The only thing below was the old sub-basement, sealed off for decades after structural issues and a rumored electrical fire. Yusuf looked pale. I found the device in the sub-basement archives. Maybe there's something else down there. Elena folded her arms. This is getting absurd. You're telling me this antique contraption wants us to go exploring in a restricted area at 3 in the morning? Yes, Yusuf said softly. Isn't that exactly the kind of thing Gödel or Turing would have done, metaphorically speaking? Elena stared at him, then at the device, then at the door. Well, it wasn't as though she was making any progress on her paper. All right, she said at last, grabbing her cardigan and a small flashlight. But if we get arrested for trespassing, you're bailing me out. The corridor was silent, save for their footsteps. When they reached the elevator, it refused to budge below the ground floor. Yusuf produced a small crowbar from his backpack, and Elena gave him a withering look of disbelief. You came prepared? Just in case, he said, shrugging. He led her to a door at the end of the corridor. A warning sign read, Authorized personnel only. The lock was old and rusted. With some effort, Yusuf pried it open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. Elena shone her flashlight. Cobwebs sparkled in the beam. The air smelled of mildew and old paper. They descended. At the bottom, a corridor stretched ahead. They passed old storage rooms, shelves of microfilm and dusty filing cabinets. The silence was thick. It felt like stepping back through time, into the intellectual catacombs of a bygone era. They came upon a heavy oak door, slightly ajar. Inside was a small reading room, lit by a single emergency bulb that flickered faintly. A round table stood in the center, covered with old notes, drawings, and what looked like a partially dismantled mechanical device, maybe a predecessor or sibling of the Project Archon box upstairs. On the wall, they found a large blackboard with scrawled equations. Elena recognized the style. It reminded her of Gödel numbering, of embedding statements within arithmetic. Across the bottom were notes about Turing machines and halting sets. In the margins, tiny diagrams of cellular automata, Rule 110, fractal patterns. It was as if someone had tried to unify Gödel, Turing, and Wolfram in one grand schema. Yusuf carefully picked up a sheet of paper from the table. It was covered with dense handwriting in fading blue ink. If the world is computationally equivalent to a universal automaton, then there must be truths that remain forever outside our predictive reach. No finite system of axioms will capture them. No algorithmic shortcut will predict their outcomes. This suggests a fundamental limit to human knowledge. Yet, paradoxically, within these unknowable regions might lie the secret of meaning itself. Elena exhaled slowly. This is extraordinary. Whoever worked here was trying to bridge logic, computation, and metaphysics. Yusuf ran a finger along a dusty shelf. Check these out, he said, producing a stack of old punch cards. They coded something in ancient punch card format, possibly instructions for the machine. Elena shook her head. It's too complicated. She shined her flashlight around the room. In a corner, partially concealed by a tarp, stood a tall metal frame. Wires dangled from it like veins, and at its center was a large spherical device that looked like an old cathode ray tube. As they approached, they realized it was another machine, larger, more complex. On its side, a label, Archon Beta. It seemed the shoebox device upstairs was just a portable terminal, or a component of something bigger. Elena pulled the tarp aside. Archon Beta loomed like some totem of forgotten dreams. On its front panel were a keyboard and a tiny monitor. A note pinned beside it read, "To ask the ultimate question is to risk ultimate ignorance." Yusuf tried a switch on the side. To their astonishment, the machine hummed to life, dim lights flickering inside the sphere. The monitor turned on, displaying the same prompt. Enter query. Elena and Yusuf exchanged glances. Was this their chance to ask something big, something that bridged all the intellectual chasms? Yusuf began, "What if—" But Elena held up a hand. She stepped forward and typed, "Why is human knowledge fundamentally limited?" The machine paused, then printed, "Because the universe itself is a form of computation beyond any finite axiomatic system. You are inside the machine you seek to understand." "Poetic," said Yusuf, trying to lighten the tension. "But it's just parroting philosophy." Elena's eyes narrowed. She typed again, "Can we ever escape these limits?" The machine responded, "To escape, you must locate the chamber of the gate. Look beyond the shelves." They looked at each other in disbelief. Now this was bordering on the absurd. Yet curiosity gnawed at them. With a determined frown, they began pushing aside shelves against the far wall. After several minutes of grunting and shoving, the shelves rolled back, revealing a hidden door. Behind it lay a small chamber, lamplit, how or by what power they could not say, with a single pedestal in the center. On the pedestal, a notebook bound in faded green leather. Elena picked it up carefully. The cover bore a single symbol, a strange mandala that combined binary digits and geometric shapes. Inside, the handwriting matched the notes outside. This must have been the reclusive mathematician's private journal. She read aloud, "I have concluded that the very search for ultimate truth, like trying to solve the halting problem or prove all arithmetic truths, is doomed. Gödel showed that certain truths are unprovable within any consistent system. Turing showed that certain problems are undecidable by any algorithm. Wolfram suggests that many systems are computationally irreducible. No shortcut exists to predict their outcome. Yet what if this limit is not a barrier but a gateway? If we embrace these mysteries, perhaps we transcend them. The chamber of the gate is not physical. It is conceptual. We must realize that we ourselves are part of the computation, and if we change our perspective, we might step outside the system." Elena paused, her voice echoing in the quiet chamber. Yusuf leaned in, brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" She shook her head. "It's metaphysical mumbo-jumbo, but maybe he's suggesting that if we stop trying to be outside observers and realize we're inside this grand computation, we'll gain a new perspective." Yusuf snorted. "That sounds like spiritual nonsense. I was hoping for a neat theorem." "I know," Elena said with a sad smile. "But Gödel's theorem, Turing's halting problem, they never gave neat answers. They always told us there's something beyond the neatness." They returned to Archon Beta. Elena placed the notebook beside it. She typed another query. "If we cannot escape the limits of formal systems, what can we do?" The machine answered, "You must dance." Yusuf burst out laughing. "Dance? Now it's just messing with us." Elena couldn't help but chuckle too. The tension broke. "We came all this way to be told to dance? Maybe it means we need a more creative approach." "Or maybe it means literally dance," Yusuf teased, doing a silly little shuffle on the grimy floor. For a moment the incongruity was hilarious. Two scholars in a dusty hidden room performing a midnight jig. Then something unexpected happened. As Yusuf danced, Arkham Beta's lights shifted hue, and the monitor displayed a scrolling pattern of cellular automata. Wolfram's Rule 30 danced across the screen, chaotic yet structured, black and white cells blinking in and out of existence. Elena stepped forward, entranced. "It's reacting." She typed again, more carefully. "You said we must dance. What does dance symbolize?" The machine responded, "Dance is a metaphor for participation. You cannot solve the system from outside. You must embody the process." Yusuf scratched his head. "This is the strangest user interface I've ever seen. It wants us to accept that we're part of the computation. But how does that help with the fundamental limits of knowledge?" Elena thought quietly. "If we're inside the computation, if our own reasoning is just another emergent pattern, then the limits Gödel and Turing identified apply to us as well. We can't outsmart the system from within. Perhaps acknowledging this is the key step. Maybe meaning arises from the interplay of what we can and can't know." She looked again at the notes scattered around. They hinted that the builder of Archon Beta believed that the realization of these limits would set the human mind free, not imprison it. "How so?" Yusuf asked, reading her expression. Because, she said, once we accept that not everything can be solved or known, we can stop chasing certainty and start engaging creatively with the unknown. We can treat complexity not as a wall, but as a playground for discovery. Instead of a final truth, we find ever-unfolding patterns that we dance with. She spread her hands, feeling the dusty air. It's not a neat conclusion, I admit, but it resonates with the spirit of what we know from Gödel, Turing, and Wolfram. Total understanding is impossible, so meaning must come from the journey rather than the destination. Yusuf nodded slowly. It's philosophical, almost mystical. He checked his watch. And it's almost 4 a.m. We've got to get out of here before campus security finds us and thinks we're lunatics. Before leaving, Elena asked one final question of Archon Beta. What happened to the creator of this machine? The machine's response took longer, as if searching old memories. The creator entered the dance fully. They no longer exist in separate form. Oh, that's not ominous at all, Yusuf muttered. Maybe he just vanished. Elena smiled sadly. Or maybe he realized that defining himself as separate from the system was meaningless. He became part of the patterns he studied. It's poetic nonsense, yes, but I like it. They left Archon Beta humming softly, returned upstairs, replaced the shoebox device in Elena's office, and locked the door. They parted ways in the corridor, promising to meet tomorrow and discuss what they'd found. The next day, Elena arrived at her office with a fresh mind, determined to write down what she'd learned. The day was bright, and students bustled in the hall. She found Yusuf waiting there holding 2 coffees. I got you fresh coffee this time, he said with a grin. No midnight sludge. Bless you, she said, taking the cup. The warmth spread through her hands. I was thinking about last night, about the whole notion of computational irreducibility, and how it implies that even simple systems can produce behavior no simpler than stepping through each state. Doesn't that mean that a lot of what we'd like to shortcut, like predicting the future or knowing ultimate truths, just isn't possible? Yeah, Yusuf replied, but that also means we're free. We're not trapped in a predetermined pattern we can fully analyze from the outside. We're explorers in infinite complexity. They sat down, and Elena opened a blank document on her laptop. She began drafting a paper that interwove their experience with the theoretical groundwork. Gödel's incompleteness placed limits on formal proof. Turing's halting problem placed limits on computation and decidability. Wolfram's computational irreducibility extended these limits into the behavior of seemingly simple systems, ensuring no shortcuts exist for understanding them completely. Their nighttime adventure suggested that these limits aren't just academic curiosities, but philosophical signposts. We must engage with the unknown rather than attempt to conquer it fully. As she typed, Yusuf scanned through the notes they'd taken. Hey, did we ever really figure out who built that machine? No, said Elena. Just those cryptic hints. Maybe it was some eccentric professor from decades ago, or maybe it was a joint project that got abandoned. Yusuf frowned. I'm curious. He pulled out his phone and started searching through the university's digital archives. After some minutes, he said, I found something. A Dr. Adrian Schumann, a mathematician and engineer who worked here in the 1960s. He went missing. Rumor had it he was obsessed with bridging logic and computation to find a meta-theoretical vantage point, whatever that means. Elena tilted her head. The machine's last message about the creator no longer existing in separate form echoed in her mind. A chill ran down her spine. So maybe Dr. Schumann was the creator. Most likely, Yusuf said. The archives say he disappeared one night. Some say he just left academia. Others claim he got lost in his own experiments. They worked for a few hours, refining their paper, laughing at the strange instructions the machine gave them, and pondering the weird metaphors about dancing and participation. It felt good to transform the night's surreal adventure into a coherent reflection. At noon, they decided to take a break and have lunch at the campus cafe. As they walked down the hall, a young student approached Elena. Professor Mori? The student asked timidly. I wanted to let you know that the notes you gave me last week helped a lot. I was really stuck on understanding Turing machines, but now it's clearer. Thank you. Elena smiled warmly. I'm glad to hear it. Just remember, The beauty is in the process of learning, not just the final answer. The student nodded and hurried off. Yusuf gave Elena a knowing look. You're starting to sound like the machine. Elena rolled her eyes but smiled. Don't start. Next thing you know, I'll be telling my students to dance their way through theorems. They stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. A light breeze rustled the leaves. The sun glinted off the old campus buildings. Everything felt more vivid, as if accepting uncertainty and complexity had painted the world in richer colors. They sat down under a large oak tree to eat their sandwiches. Yusuf bit into his hummus wrap and said, You know, what's really funny is that after all this, we don't have a neat conclusion. We just have more reasons why neat conclusions aren't possible. Elena laughed. Oh, the irony. It's like writing a proof that you can't prove everything. Or building a machine that tells you it can't tell you everything, he added. They toasted their coffee cups, a gentle clink of cardboard. Humor was a much-needed antidote to existential truths. Suddenly, Elena's phone buzzed, an unknown caller. With a puzzled frown, she answered. A static-filled voice said, Do not neglect the dancing. She pulled the phone away from her ear, startled. Hello, who is this? Just static, then silence. Yusuf leaned forward. What was that? Elena shook her head, face pale. The voice said, Do not neglect the dancing. They stared at each other. Must be a prank, Yusuf said, though his voice lacked conviction. Elena took a steadying breath. Probably. Maybe one of the grad students overheard us talking and wanted to play a joke. They tried to laugh it off. But a strange feeling lingered like a glitch in a program you can't quite locate. Over the following weeks, Elena and Yusuf refined their manuscript. Embracing the mystery, Gödel, Turing, Wolfram, and the philosophy of computational limits. The paper argued that the limits proved by these giants of logic and computation are not mere technical curiosities, but essential clues about our place in the universe. We inhabit a system that cannot be fully captured by any finite set of rules or predictions. Accepting this can free us to engage meaningfully with complexity, rather than forever despairing at unsolvable riddles. They submitted the paper to a reputable journal. While waiting for a response, life continued. Lectures, office hours, departmental meetings. The memory of the sub-basement and Arkham Beta began to fade into a quiet corner of their minds, as such strange incidents often do. But something subtle changed in Elena's teaching style. She found herself encouraging students to approach problems playfully, to appreciate the beauty of uncertainty. She'd say things like, Mathematics isn't just about proving what we can, it's about dancing with what we can't, prompting confused smiles and occasional chuckles. Yusuf noticed changes in himself too. He relaxed more, obsessed less over having all the answers. He took up painting in his spare time, creating abstract patterns reminiscent of cellular automata. It pleased him to work on something that didn't yield to tidy solutions. One late afternoon, about 2 months after their adventure, a letter arrived in Elena's mailbox. It bore no return address, only the university's internal mail sticker. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a man, presumably Dr. Adrian Schumann, standing beside Archon Beta, smiling proudly. On the back, written in that same faded blue ink, Remember, you are part of the computation. Elena felt a shiver run up her spine. She had told no one outside Yusuf about Schumann, and certainly no one knew she was interested in him. Had Yusuf sent it? No, that didn't seem like him. She locked the photo in her desk drawer. That evening, she decided to pay one more visit to the sub-basement. She told Yusuf, who insisted on coming along. At midnight, armed with better flashlights and cautious optimism, they crept down again. They found the hidden room and the Archon Beta machine just as they'd left it. Only this time, the power switch did nothing. The machine was dead, silent, as if it had never run at all. They searched for any sign of who left the photo, or how. Nothing. Elena typed on the machine's keyboard, though no power flowed. "If you can hear us," she said softly, feeling silly, "thank you for what you taught us. We'll remember that some truths are beyond our reach, and that's okay." No response, of course. As they turned to leave, Yusuf paused. Do you think the creator really transcended somehow, or is that just a metaphor? Elena gave him a gentle smile. I think it's a metaphor for understanding. Maybe he realized that trying to escape limits is futile. Instead, he embraced the complexity so fully that he no longer felt confined by it. That's a kind of transcendence, even if it's just a shift in perspective. Yusuf nodded thoughtfully. Perspective is everything. They headed back up, locking the door behind them. This time, Elena left a small note in the room. To whoever finds this, embrace the dance. Limits define meaning. As they ascended the dark stairs, Yusuf asked, Do you think we've really learned anything concrete? Elena laughed, the sound echoing in the stairwell. Concrete? Probably not. But I feel more at peace with the idea that we'll never have all the answers, that our minds and our methods have inherent limits, and that there's a strange beauty in that. Yeah, Yusuf said softly. Me too. They parted at the corridor, each heading to their separate homes. Outside, the stars glimmered, uncountably many, like the real numbers, many of which can't be described by any finite formula. Yet people still look at them, dream under them, find stories in their patterns. Months passed, their paper was published and sparked modest discussion. Some colleagues found their conclusions too philosophical, not rigorous enough. Others found them refreshing, a reminder that mathematics and computer science touch on deep mysteries about knowledge, reality, and meaning. One bright spring morning, Elena was teaching a seminar on logic and computation. She'd just concluded a lecture on incompleteness and undecidability. A student raised her hand. Professor Mori, if we can't prove everything or compute every answer, then what's the point? Elena smiled. The point, Anna, is that knowledge isn't just about what we can prove or compute. It's also about what we do with the uncertainty. We learn to navigate complexity, to appreciate patterns even if we can't fully describe them, to make meaning even without ultimate answers. She paused, remembering the machine's cryptic advice. In short, we learn to dance. The students looked puzzled but interested. Perhaps someday they would understand. After class, as Elena packed her notes, she felt a vibration in her jacket pocket. Her phone again, another unknown caller. She considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. Hello? A faint whisper. Do not neglect the dancing. She sighed and smiled. Let whoever it was continue their prank. She was done seeking final answers. She pocketed the phone and stepped out into the sunlight. The world was complex and incomprehensible, but that was fine. She would continue her dance of learning and teaching, a never-ending interplay of truth, uncertainty, and meaning. That night, back in her office, Elena decided to check her email. She found a single message, no sender, no subject. It contained only a snippet of code and a final line of text. You are Archon Beta. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She rechecked the message, tried to find its origin. Nothing. Just random code, meaningless at a glance, and that phrase, you are Archon Beta. A chill came over her. Had she and Yusuf been part of the system all along, enacting roles decided by the old notes, the machine's hints, their own curiosity? Were they nothing more than participants in a grand computational narrative? The entire sub-basement adventure, the cryptic instructions, even the call, could it have been orchestrated by some larger mind, some system of which they were elements? She laughed out loud, shaking her head. How absurd. Yet a tiny part of her wondered if meaning was recursive like that. Perhaps she had always been dancing inside the machine of reality, never outside it. With a smile, equal parts amused and unsettled, she closed her laptop. She stood in the quiet office and twirled once, a small dance step, acknowledging the infinite complexity and her humble, joyous place in it.